the author of Genesis really is setting the stage in chapters 1 through 11. So there's a couple themes that we're really tracing from the author of Genesis, a couple things that the author of Genesis wants us to understand about the beginning. One of those is just about separation and togetherness, that from the very start of his book, he's showing that, there's togetherness in the Garden of Eden, togetherness between humans and God and humans and each other, and how we begin to see separation, that we begin to see God and humans separate from each other and humans separate from each other as well. So we talked about, the fall in chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. And we also talked about their sons, Cain and Abel, and how that continues the story for the author of Genesis on this separation of humans from each other. So we're going to look at two stories that are remaining in the first 11 chapters of Genesis quickly at the beginning of tonight, and that's Noah and the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. And both of these stories are really the author of Genesis once again showing us the separation that's happening between humans and God and humans from each other. And then it's going to connect to the promise of Abraham, the promise to Abraham from God, beginning in chapter 12, and how God is using Abraham and his family, his descendants, to try to reconcile that in some way. It also picks up the theme of the author of Genesis. The other one we're tracing besides separation and unity, or separation and togetherness, is from the beginning, the author of Genesis tells us that God can make something from nothing and turns nobodies into somebodies. So we're going to see over and over again, the rest of Genesis is really showing us all the nobodies that God turns into somebodies, or people who were nobodies that God still used. And so we'll start tonight just with the story of Noah and the flood. I chose this picture specifically because it's, in a lot of ways, the story of Noah and the flood is a children's story, I think, for a lot of us, or at least the way that we understand it. Or if I asked you to repeat the story right now, you'd probably repeat it in a way that you've heard since you were a kid. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just not really the whole picture of what's happening with Noah and the flood and what the author of Genesis is trying to tell us. It's a great story to use for children because of children are just going to naturally be attracted to this kind of story that is, the animals, 2 by 2, they made it out of gopher, barky, barky, with a song going along with it and everything else, that there's something that's easy to communicate to children in the sense that you could say God was rescuing humanity, God, rescued the animals, rescued Noah and his family, and then, this great rainbow at the end of your children's story, of God's promise not just to Noah and his family, but to all of humanity and to all of animal kind as well. And so it makes a great children's story, but I think we have to wrestle with this part of Scripture, as we've talked about before, like Jacob wrestling with God. That in Jewish tradition, they love to wrestle with Scripture, and we kind of pick that habit and try to pick that practice up of wrestling with Scripture. So we wrestle with this. I'm going to start here in chapter 6 of Genesis. This is starting in verse 9. It says, "This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth." And then skipping down to verse 22, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. So right from the start of this story, the author of Genesis is again setting up this idea of separation, that because of the wickedness of humanity, not only are they separated from God, humanity separated from God, but of course that's going to lead to separation from each other. That if humans are violent, as it says here, that's violence, we should understand as violence against each other. If they're just violence against a tree, there's probably not cause for the destruction of the world here. But if they're violent against each other, fellow humans, then that obviously comes from and leads to separation of humans from each other. And so once again, the author of Genesis is showing this separation that's happening and how God is trying to rectify that. We see over and over again separation happening between God and humans from each other, and how God is trying to help fix that or help it in some way. And so right away we're told that God is talking to this man Noah, who it says is a righteous person. And so everything that God walks him through here in those intervening verses 14 through 21 about, the ark and setting that all up, it says in summary, Noah did everything as God commanded him. So in verse 7, the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation." And once again, skipping to verse 5, and Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. So I got a few pictures up here. Here's there's been a number of people around the world, particularly in the United States, who have built arks like to the scale that it says in the Bible. So you probably can't make out too well some of the people down there below, but it gives you some idea of the scale if you can see the people kind of in that big open-looking parking lot area, like the asphalt on the far right, or kind of bottom right-hand corner. There's two people kind of right there in the middle. So it gives you some idea of the scale here of this particular ark. This ark, I think, is shaped how most of us would picture it or expect. It looks like a ship. Here's a guy, he's a Dutch guy who built one that he tried to sail. It actually didn't turn out to sail very well, but he gave it a shot. But again, here, this ark, again, looks like something that we would tend to expect. It looks like a ship, a seaworthy vessel. Here's next slide is just showing you some of the scale of what the ark, according to the dimensions given in the Bible, how it would have compared to the Santa Maria, the Titanic, the Queen Mary. I'm not even totally sure what the Wyoming is. Is that Revolutionary War? Anyone know what what's that? Yeah, I'm not totally sure what the Wyoming is. It says it's a wood ship. But, so it gives you, again, some idea of what the scale would have been there. However, here's a totally different view of, on the next slide. This has been offered as what the ark could have looked like. It would have been much bigger. This, you can tell by the door, that a normal human being would walk through that door, that the ark would have needed to be much bigger. But you notice just the roundness of it. There's a few reasons offered for this shape for the ark. One is just it probably would do much better in a storm. Like if it's going to storm, it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights, and there's going to be storm, and they're going to be on the water total for like 150 days, then, having something like this that's a little more just kind of can rock with the waves rather than a ship that could be tossed about more easily. But the other reason, the main reason, is because the word that's used for ark here is the exact same word that's used for the basket that Moses is placed into. That is also an ark. So when Moses in book of Exodus placed into an ark, the basket, normally how we translate it, and put into the river to escape murder by the Pharaoh, it's the same word that's used by the author for Noah's ark. And so because that ark that Moses is placed into is like a basket that would be placed on the water, some people think that this is what the ark would have actually looked like. And then still yet, here's a much more boxy view of the ark. You can kind of see it's literally just looks like a box. And then the reason for that is because as Garrett, if you were part of his class, mentioned, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, it uses the same word for Noah's ark as Ark of the Covenant. And so because the Ark of the Covenant was a box, usually with like legs on it, and in fact, if you look at, there's some mosaics in Israel today, in Turkey, all around the world, that early kind of Christian art, when they portrayed Noah's Ark, it looked like a box with legs on it. It didn't look anything like a ship. So that's because that same word was used. Now that's only in the Greek version. In the Hebrew version, that's not the case. So you don't see that really before Jesus' time, them portraying Noah's Ark that way. But this is a boxier view. Here's another one. Another reason being offered for the boxy view of Noah's Ark is because, again, they thought it would be better for storms. In fact, you can go on YouTube and look at a video that, like, you could see the ark kind of topples over and over again in the water, but they showed how it could be built, that would have been a much more efficient way to build the ark. So we don't know exactly what the ark looked like. I think most of us just kind of picture some, kind of ship. But in verse 11 of chapter 7, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, and on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were open, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights." So this is the beginning of, Noah's setting things up. He's building the ark. He's talking to people around him. So obviously, when the rains start, people would probably start to think, hey, maybe that guy Noah was on to something. But by then it was too late for them. Verse 17, "For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. So you notice there the author says the same thing kind of over and over again. The birds died, the animals died, the people died, the birds died, the animals died, the people died, all the living animals, all the living humans, all the plant life. He kind of says the same thing over and over again. It's really, I think, to drive that home. And we skip over this part, I think, most of the time in the story, and we don't really think much about what that actually would have meant. If you've seen a couple years ago, there was a movie that came out. I think it was just called Noah, right? The one with Russell Crowe. It was very controversial in, I think, Christian circles because there was stuff in the story, in the movie, that wasn't like word for word what the Bible says, which if you did word for word what the Bible said, it probably would have been a pretty boring movie. So kind of naturally they have to do something. But it actually followed good Jewish tradition, that movie. And one of the things it portrayed was these people screaming out from what was temporarily, at least, dry land, and screaming out to Noah and his family to let them in. And we don't normally think about that, this idea of, what it would be like for Noah and his family to be on that ark. This isn't part of the children's story that we normally talk about. But what that would have been like to hear, a father right outside that you could see who's got children in his arms trying to hold them above the water, a mother trying to hold her baby above the water. It would have been, I think, pretty horrific for Noah and his family to hear those things going on or happening. This is a very famous painting called The Deluge, in other words, like the flood. It's probably a little hard to make out on there, but just you can see the people in the water. And in the very far background, I'm sure you can't even see it, is the ark. So for this artist, it was like just showing, this artist was focused on those people that perished. And the ark is so far in the background that, one, it shows you how desperate their situation was, that at this point they would have lost all hope of living, but also just the idea of it's out of sight, it's out of mind. This artist is focused on the people who are drowning. And then again, kind of this, you can see this artist is portraying this small bit of dry land that's temporarily left until it's flooded, just with the bodies kind of piled up, men, women, children, animals on there. So again, it's something that we don't normally think about and don't really talk about in a children's story for obvious reasons. I don't think we should be talking about that when we're teaching it in Sunday school class to children. but it's certainly something that we should wrestle with in this story as adults. This is from this next slide is from it's from a book called the Awkward Moments Children's Bible. And so this Bible purposefully took scenarios from the Bible of kind of horrific situations or stories and turned them into a children's Bible. Now, it's obviously not actually meant for children. It's meant for adults to just get us to think. So this one is called Floaters, and it just has the passage there. The Lord regretted ever creating human beings, and he was sad. So the Lord said, I will wipe all the human race off the face of the earth. While I'm at it, I'll kill all the livestock and all the crawling things too. I'll even kill all the birds in the sky. I wish I had never created any of them in the first place. And gives the Genesis reference. And obviously there you can see the animals and the people in the water that are floaters. They are floating because they're dead, they're drowned. So again, just a part of the story I think that we don't normally think too much about and probably try not to focus too much on. But the good news in chapter 8, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. When it says God remembered Noah, it's not like he forgot he was there. It's not like, oh yeah, that guy. Like, what has he been up to the last 40 days and 40 nights or 150 days? Like, I hope they've been doing well in that boat, that basket, that box, whatever they're in. That Hebrew word that's used there for remembered is, he considered them with a purpose. He considered them like to take action. So when it says God remembered Noah, it's not that he had forgotten about him, but God is focusing on him for the next part of the story, the next bit of action. And that action is the waters receding. Skip down to verse 15. Then God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. Now, for the author of Genesis, that beginning part of the covenant with Noah and his family should remind us of the covenant with Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply, increase in number. So this kind of starting over moment of just Noah and his family, just like Adam and Eve in the garden, the same command is given to them and the same covenant made with them by God, be fruitful and multiply. Verse 18, so Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land, came out of the ark, one kind after another. Verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, the seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. And then chapter 9 tells us, God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. So again, that command and promise or covenant is repeated. And then in verse 7 again, as for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. And verse 17, so God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth. And that sign that he gives as the establishment of that covenant is, of course, the rainbow there. So again, God, the author of Genesis is showing us this separation. There was separation between humans and God and humans with each other. The result of that was the flood, and everybody but Adam or Noah's family perishing, and Noah kind of being the new Adam. There's the starting over of human life, humankind here again, and the same covenant and command given to them. So again, God promising through the sign of the rainbow that to Noah and his family and to all humankind is the beginning of reunification, beginning of togetherness after the separation. We're going to talk about the Tower of Babel here in a minute, real quickly. Are there any questions or comments on Noah and the flood? Anything on Zoom? Oh yeah, Wendy Ann? Yeah, the question is, are we supposed to take this story literally, or is it just about the separation and unity for the author. And I would say that once again, this is one of the situations where I don't think we would ever say we shouldn't take this story literally. In fact, I mean, if you look throughout history, now this may convince you or unconvince you of whether to take it literally, but there's hundreds, if not thousands, of flood stories from all people groups around the world. If you really look into the story of Noah and the flood, you're going to come across something called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it was an Akkadian story that very closely resembles or mirrors the story of Noah and the flood. Now, of course, some people would say they copied the Israelite story of Noah and the flood. Other people are going to say that the author of Genesis copied the Akkadian story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But all over the world, we found cave paintings, stories written down of some kind of flood narrative. A lot of people groups around the world have had the same story. Now, some people have proposed that that was all the same, all those stories were about the same event, that this was a real event that happened, but people all over the world wrote down this story. Now, does that mean that all these different people groups had their own Noah family that survived it? We don't really know. I mean, according to them, they would say yes, but for the author of Genesis, again, I think if you ask the author of Genesis, he would be confused about why you were asking. And that's not a dig on your question. It's something I think all of us ask about all of these stories. Are we supposed to take them literally? And, getting to the Tower of Babel next, are we supposed to take it literally that there were humans that really thought they were going to build a tower that would reach to the heavens? Are we supposed to take that literally? But for the author of Genesis, I don't think it's that he would be confused that you're asking it at all, but rather, why are you getting caught up on that? Obviously the author of Genesis is moving very quickly through a period of time in these first 11 chapters, because what he wants to get to is the story of Abraham. What the author wants us to get to or hear about is God reconciling the earth to him through Abraham and his descendants. So the setup of this, of the garden, of Adam and Eve, of Cain and Abel, of Noah and the flood, and of the Tower of Babel, is just to show us the separation happening, and then Abraham as the reconciliation of that. So I think it's tough for us sometimes because, especially those of us who are coming kind of from a Western world mindset, that we want to read facts. We want to read truth. We want to know, these things happen. If this thing didn't happen, don't tell it to me, or tell me it's fiction. But the author of Genesis doesn't give us that satisfaction. But for the author of Genesis 2, he's not trying to set up a book that's full of doctrine and theology and moral code. We're going to see throughout, turning nobodies into somebodies naturally comes with dealing with not just imperfect human beings, but bad human beings sometimes that God still uses for his purposes. So I think it's naturally going to come about for us to want to know, are these stories real? But for the author of Genesis, I think he's like, well, don't really worry about that. Of course, that's hard for us to hear. But again, I certainly wouldn't say that this is not a literal story that happened. I think some people think all these different people groups around the world having flood narrative stories in their history kind of says that the Bible, the version we read in the Bible, is probably not true. I kind of think it's the opposite. I think it lends more support to the idea that a real event occurred upon the earth. Whether the author of Genesis told us the story exactly how it happened or changed some things for the purpose of his book, we don't really know, and I don't think the author would want us to get too caught up on it. But like I said, it's natural for us to wonder, and I think right for us to wonder, because that's part of wrestling with Scripture. Most of us, I think, are coming from a Western world mindset, so our wrestle with Scripture is going to look different than somebody coming from a Middle Eastern perspective, a Far Eastern mindset. It's going to be a different kind of wrestling than I think a lot of us are probably doing. Yeah, Bob? Oh. Yeah, her comment was about new believers and their reaction, I think, to this story. And certainly I would say for new believers especially, I would focus on the same things we focus on for the children's story. And that's not to dogs, to insult somebody who's a new believer. But just as Paul says, any of us who are new believers, whether we're new believers at age 6 or age 66, we drink milk at first before we eat solid food. And that's part of it. And I think for a new believer, what I would focus on with this story with them is there is separation between God and humanity with each other, and God was trying to fix that and made a promise not to do it in the same way again. Said at the end, I'm not ever going to do this again this way. So I think there's something to take comfort in that. Bob? Sure. Zoom people, he's grabbing the mic.
Is it on? Okay. So I was saying that back to the theme of together and separation. So this obviously huge separation here, right? And you hit upon the fact that there was a parallel between Adam and Noah. Like Noah was a new Adam as far as be fruitful and multiply. But also Adam walked with God, right? I mean, he was in the garden with God. Well, Noah was selected. It says he was selected for this because, I mean, he doesn't say it that way, but because he walked with God. So he was together with God.
Yeah, that's a good connection, I think, between Adam and Noah as the new Adam there. Any other questions or comments? Anybody on Zoom? Rob? Okay. Well, let's look real quick before we get to Abraham and his family. In chapter 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, it says in chapter 11, verse 1, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So a couple things to know about this story. If you're not familiar with it, just from that introduction, you can understand people have now come, this is after the flood, and people, humankind is repopulating the earth, and at some point later, they're getting together, and at this point it says there's one language spoken by humankind. But they get together, they say, hey, let's build a tower to heaven. The key verse there for the author is let's make a name for ourselves. In other words, this is a very selfish kind of egotistical thing to be doing. Let's make a name for ourselves by, building this tower to the heavens. And we have no idea what their concept of the heavens was. Was the heavens like a skyscraper in one of our cities? That's all they were trying to do. I think a lot of times, especially as Christians, we kind of think of this as they were literally trying to build a tower all the way to heaven. And for us, we kind of scoff at that, saying you can't do that. But we don't know exactly what their concept was. And for the author of Genesis, I don't think he's as concerned with that as they're doing something that is selfish, to praise themselves rather than praise God. And the other reason the author of Genesis even tells us this story, because what happens is God sees this and wants to dissuade this from happening, so he automatically makes all these people start speaking all these different languages. They can't communicate, and then they kind of disperse over the face of the earth. So for the author of Genesis, there's two things that are the reason he tells us this story. One is, again, separation. There's separation between humans and God if they're trying to do this, if they're trying to bring praise to themselves rather than praise to God. And then the separation that happens between humans as a result of God giving them all these different languages to speak instead of just one. But the other reason the author of Genesis tells the story is to just simply explain to his reader and listener how all these different nations came about that speak all these different languages. Because if Moses is writing this or a later author is writing this, by that point they know the world is full of all these different ethnicities and nations and languages being spoken. So their question, of course, was, well, how did that happen? If God creates mankind in the garden, in the Garden of Eden, puts them in the Garden of Eden, how do we get to a place that everybody's so different from each other? And so the author of Genesis is using this story to explain that. And a lot of the stories in the first 11 chapters for the author of Genesis are trying to just simply explain something basic to the reader and listener before he gets to the story of Abraham. Some people connect this story. There's nothing about this in the Bible, but In Jewish tradition, they say that Abraham was one of the 12 people that actually refused to take part in this, that build, putting the bricks together and everything else. They're persecuted, they're thrown in jail. In the end, it's kind of Abraham who's left standing as the one person who's the holdout who won't participate in the building of the Tower of Babel. Again, this is Jewish tradition, not something in the Bible, but that comes about by the question that comes from where we start Abraham's story here. Is the Tower of Babel again? This one's Arches National Park. But this stone structure is called the Tower of Babel. We've used that in, Babel. Even, think of like, Rosetta Stone is like a language learning program. There's also one that's called Babel, that you can use to learn other languages. It's based on the story of the Tower of Babel. So the question for Abraham being connected to the Tower of Babel is not just because of the direct succession between the Tower of Babel story. It tells us that Abraham, his father, he traveled with his father and his family from their home region of Ur. And then all of a sudden it gives us this in chapter 12. The Lord said to Abram, this is before he was re-given the name Abraham. So the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So the question is, all of a sudden, you have this guy who emerges that's somehow special. It tells us that he was just simply one of his father Terah's family, traveling from Ur. They're in this region of Haran. They're going along, and all of a sudden it just tells us God makes this promise to Abraham. So the question is actually, well, what's so special about this guy? What's so special about Abram? Why would God choose Abram? So one of the Jewish traditions that came about from that is this connection to the Tower of Babel story that, one thing that separated him from the rest was he was somebody who refused to participate in that. For the author of Genesis, who doesn't tell us anything about a connection between Abram and the Tower of Babel, we're never fully explained it either. There's going to be a few times where Abram's obedience to God it's reckoned to him as righteousness. In other words, his obedience to God is what separates him and why God makes this covenant with him. But the author of Genesis never really fully explains it beyond that. We're just left to understand that God knew what he was doing and chose this man Abram for a reason. And so that's can be a little unsatisfying, but this is a more complete picture of the covenant with Abraham we're going to get over these next few chapters. God calls him out of his land, gives him a new name, which we will get to as well, going from Abram to Abraham. Promised him many descendants. Abraham would become a father of faith for the Jewish people. And Abraham's son had 12 sons, that's Jacob, who became the ancestors of the tribe of Israel. And I think for the author of Genesis, most importantly is that third verse. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So again, you have this theme of separation in the first 11 chapters, and then this promise to Abraham. And the promise is not just that Abraham's family will be reconciled with God, that there will be unity and togetherness with God where there was separation, but that will be true of all people all over the world because of Abraham and his family. So I think that's pretty central for the author of Genesis here in this promise and covenant. So, what happened to that slide? What in the world? It doesn't look like that on this screen. I don't know why that happened. Well, I was going to say pay attention to the words in orange, but you might not be able to see them up there. If you're on Zoom or you have it on your phone or iPad or something in front of you, you might be able to see it, but I'm going to point these out more completely in a minute, so don't worry if you can't totally see them. In fact, I'll just tell you what words they So this is picking up right after that promise and covenant with Abraham. Verse 4, so Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So that's one area to pay attention to, Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. There's another geography reference there to be aware of. And they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem, again, city to note. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram, said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there, he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Bethel and Ai, there's two more cities to be aware of. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. That's the desert, and that's the final one that's in orange to be aware of. So here's a map that might help you follow that a little bit better, if you can see it. But on the very far right of this map is the region of as it kind of traces up towards as it goes up and to the left, it goes up to the region of Haran, or Padan Haram. That's going to be somewhere that Jacob visits later. And then goes down, the travels past Lebanon and into the land of Canaan. You won't be able to probably see the city names there, but he travels first to Shechem, and then to between Bethel and Ai, and then down to the Negev, to Hebron there. The reason that's important for the author of Genesis is for this reason. This is the same path that's traced by all three of these men. So you have Abraham, you have Jacob, and you have Joshua. So first Abram comes to Shechem, then he goes to Bethel and Ai, and then he goes down to the Negev. Jacob, his grandson, is going to travel the same path. He'll actually be all the way up in Padan Haram, where Abram and his family just came from, and travel first to Shechem, then to Bethel and Ai, and then finally to the Negev, to the desert. Now the author of Genesis, what he wants us to understand, and the reader and listener to understand, is both of those men's journeys parallel the journey that Joshua is going to take when he leads the Israelites into the land. The very first place he's going to come to is Ai, and camp between Bethel and Ai, and then he'll go to Shechem, and then he'll go to Negev last. So he visits the same three places, leading the Israelites into this land as they conquer the land and take it for themselves as the land promised to them by God, the promised land. So if Moses is writing this at a time when Joshua has just done this or is about to do it and knows his path, there's a connection there. If a later author is writing it, the connection is much more obvious, that the reader and listener are supposed to understand the same path of salvation that Joshua led us on, us meaning the Israelites as the reader and listener of this story. The same path of salvation Joshua led us on was set up already by Abram and by Jacob. That they took the same path, that they walked the same areas, they went on the same journey that we have just come on, or we have just been led on by Joshua. So the setup there is certainly for the author of Genesis. Again, here, this map might be a little clearer. Leaving on that number 1, going up to Padan Haram, 2, that's where he's called by God, verses 1 through 3, and then goes down to Shechem, and Bethel and Ai aren't on there, but then goes down to Hebron in the Negev in the desert. We're going to get to the story in a minute of him going to Egypt and then coming back, and returning to the land, just as Joshua and the Israelites are in Egypt and return or come to the promised land as well. So for the author of Genesis, he wants us to understand the connection there between those three men and the path of salvation. Yeah, Rob?
There's a question from Corey and Grace asking about Abraham. It says, Abraham was chosen and God made a covenant with him because he was obedient in every way that God wanted him to do so. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, where's my Galatians passage? Because Paul's going to tell us this in a similar way. So this is Galatians, thanks Corey and Grace. This is Galatians chapter 3. Paul writing here. Galatians chapter 3, verse 16 through 18. The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. Scripture does not say, and to seeds, meaning many people, but and to your seed, meaning one person who is Christ. What I mean is this: the law, introduced 430 years later, does not set aside the covenant previously established by God and thus do away with the promise. For if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on the promise. But God in his grace gave it to Abraham through a promise. And that promise, as what Corey and Grace were just saying, was a result of God setting Abraham apart as somebody who was obedient to him. That's why we see the author of Genesis a few times say Abraham obeyed God, and it was considered righteousness. It was counted for him as righteous. In other words, like a little checkbox, a pros and cons list. You know, on the pros side, God said, "You're obedient. That's the same as being righteous. The same as being set apart." And righteous man is his simple obedience. We see this first from his father, actually, who leads his family out of Ur on the far right there by the number 1 and up to Paddan Aram, and that's where his father Terah dies. And then the promise that God says, or that calls to Abraham of, go to the place I will lead you. That's extremely vague. You know, like there's no other instruction given there by God to this man Abram. Like, go to the place I will lead you. And, well, you know, is there a map or is there a general direction we're heading? Like, what are we supposed to be doing here? But for the author of Genesis, the important thing is that Abram does it. Abram goes wherever God leads him, and that leads him, of course, to the land of Canaan. That will be the promised land to all of his descendants, the Israelites. But it's that obedience that Corey and Grace there were talking about that is what sets Abraham apart. Because he was an ordinary guy. I mean, there's nothing spectacular about him. Unless you believe the tradition of him as the lone holdout at the Tower of Babel, there's nothing that the author of Genesis actually tells us that's unique or remarkable about him. Only that he's obedient. I mean, in the same way that, you know, a few verses over and over, and you see in the Noah story, and Noah did exactly as God commanded him. You know, so there was an obedience from Noah as well that is similar in Abraham's story, that he is obedient. But other than that, he's an ordinary guy. He has no, you know, there's no hidden talents that we're told about later. He's got no supernatural kind of faith, just simple obedience. He was a very ordinary guy. He certainly would be somebody that the author of Genesis would consider a nobody. Perhaps that's why the author of Genesis doesn't tell us anything unique about Abraham from the start. That what the author of Genesis wants us to know is that this man is a nobody that God turns into a somebody. Let's see, here's one more. Yeah, question?
Because they could have just took a shortcut, right?
Yeah, it's called the Fertile Crescent. You see, I put this map up because it's much more clear than a map like the last one. So you see all the green there is something called the Fertile Crescent. So following where there was water would have made a lot of sense. So if Terah, Abraham's father, is leading his family on this path, you know, and then especially for Abram, who's coming down from that top area in Haran, to the land of Canaan, to the promised land, and God has just simply said, go where I'll lead you. You know, to trace where there's water at least would have given them some sort of, I think, safety and security that God is providing for them along the way as well. Yeah. That's where he's coming from, so we assume that's where he was actually born. Yeah, that's a good question. She's asking if Abraham was born in Ur, would he not have been considered Jewish, or really? There was no Jewish people really at this point. The Jewish people are his descendants, the Israelites. But yeah, I think somebody just said, yeah, he was pagan. We see that again as a connection between Abram and Joshua and Jacob, where Abram comes from Ur, and the author of Genesis tells us he leaves behind his foreign gods. Now, when Jacob's traveling back from Haran, the same place his father or his grandfather Abraham had come from, when he travels from there to Bethel, the same place his grandfather went, he also at Bethel tells his family to leave behind all the foreign gods that they had picked up when they were out of the land of Canaan, out of the promised land. And then for Joshua, when he leads the Israelites into the promised land and gets to Bethel, and Shechem, what does he tell them to do? Leave behind the foreign gods. So there's a connection there again for the author of Genesis of leaving behind these foreign gods, these pagan gods, and worshiping only Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, of the Israelites there. Okay, I had skipped to that glacier patch, so I found back where we should be here. Yeah. Yeah.
Did Abraham, in essence, invade the Canaanites? I mean, was that a war? Is that like a war? Because the Canaanites were there.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. It actually leads us into where our story is going with Abram and his nephew Lot, where it tells us that there is animosity between themselves and the other people groups that are in this area. We wouldn't consider it invading the land. Certainly we would consider it invading the land when Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land, that they are invading the land. Whether Abram was invading the land is probably less likely, only in the sense that he wasn't coming with an army. It's possible that his family and their possessions were sizable already at that point, leaving Ur and then Haran to come down to the land of Canaan, to the promised land. But certainly they would have been seen much more as people coming in that are going to trade with you, be your neighbor, more so than an invader at this point. Like I said, Joshua will definitely be seen as an invader later on, but Abraham probably would not have been viewed that way by the surrounding people groups. There's nothing that says that they try to keep him out. And just like any neighbor you might have, there's going to be struggles and problems and issues that he has with them. But certainly not at that point of coming into the land. I don't think they would have seen him that way. Any other question or comment? Yeah, Larry? Yeah, the question is there anybody at the time of Abram who knew God, knew Yahweh, or had they forgotten him? There's nothing. I mean, certainly Yahweh is going to come to be known as the God of the Israelites. At this point, there are no Israelites because that's Abraham and his descendants who are the Israelites. So it's going to be there. The other people groups would have seen that as Abraham, his family's gods, and everybody had their own gods and goddesses, whether you were part of the family, a people group, a nation, a region, whatever it was. And for people at that time, they did not have the understanding that some gods and goddesses were real and others were not. They assumed that all gods and goddesses were real. It was only a question of whose god or goddess was stronger on a particular day when they went to battle or had disagreements with each other. It's the question of, is your God stronger today, or is my God is stronger today than your God? And that's what they viewed as settling things. It was never a question of, my God is real and yours is not, or mine is the one true God and yours is not. That comes in with Abraham and his family, and then certainly by the time of Moses, that is the case. So when Abraham comes into the land here, it's doubtful that anybody there would have been worshiping Yahweh. Abraham really brings, and we don't, from the author in Genesis, we're not even really told that his family is worshiping Yahweh in the land of Ur. because when they leave it and go up to Haran, they leave behind their foreign gods and goddesses and only worship Yahweh. So it's probably less likely than they're doubtful that anybody in the land of Canaan, in the promised land, where Abraham brings his family, that they would have been worshiping Yahweh at that point. That's something that they bring with them. Any other question or comment? So let's look at Abraham in Egypt. In fact, we don't have time to read through it, so I'll kind of just tell you the story. This is in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, if you're looking on. And there's a picture up of Abraham and Sarah kind of meeting with Pharaoh. What happens is they go into the land of Egypt. It says there's a famine. They leave. They go there. This is a parallel later for the story of Jacob and Joseph being in Egypt as well. So they go to Egypt. They get there, and before they get there, Abraham says to his wife Sarah, at this point called Sarai, when we get there, if we tell them you're my wife, they're going to kill me because you're beautiful. They're going to want you for their own. So don't tell them you're my wife when we get there. Tell them that you're my sister. So she goes along with this. They get to Egypt. It says even that Pharaoh took her as his wife. There's some question there of whether that marriage was consummated, not consummated. The author of Genesis doesn't tell us, but he does tell us Pharaoh took her as his wife, and it's sometime later that all of a sudden plagues strike the people of Egypt. Again, a parallel again for the author of Genesis to later in the Exodus when Moses comes in, talks to Pharaoh, and there's plagues that come upon the people. Now, at that point, the plagues lead to the people being let go. The author of Genesis used the same language here to say that when Pharaoh sees all these plagues happening to his people and says somehow, we're not told by the author of Genesis how he discovers this, but somehow he discovers that Sarah is really Abraham's wife and not his sister. And he comes to Abraham and said, why in the world did you do this to me? Why did you bring this plague on our people? And the author of Genesis says in the same way that he says in Exodus, he let her go, or he let them go. And then at that point, the plagues stop and are lifted there. And now when Abraham and Sarah leave Egypt, it tells us that basically the Pharaoh just showered money and riches upon them. And so here's another picture in the next slide. You can kind of see some of the riches portrayed here. Their fine clothing and stuff around them, and just where they're living. This is while they're about to leave Egypt and head back to the land of Canaan, head back to the Negev, to the desert region. But Pharaoh does this really just to buy off again Abraham's God. You know, he's thinking, your God did this to us as a result of you lying and saying Sarah is your sister and not saying she's your wife. So here's all these riches and money and camels and men servants and maid servants. Now get out of here before you bring something else back on us. And so Abraham and Sarah leave and go back to the land of Canaan with all these riches. It seems like that his family already had some sort of wealth to them when they came into the land, when they left Ur and came into the land. But certainly at this point now, Abraham would have been considered particularly well off and wealthy when he gets back to the land of Canaan. So that story is going to come back a few times in the story of Abraham and his descendants. So we went over it real quick, but just kind of keep that in your mind of what is happening here with Abraham's lie about Sarah being his sister and not his wife. So our next story, this is in chapter 13. And again, we're not going to read through it because we don't have time, but I'll tell you, this is the picture up here is of Abraham and Lot. So they get back to the land of Canaan. Now they start to have a little strife with their neighbors. You know, they're not invaders, but they're bad neighbors. You know, maybe the other people are the bad neighbors. I'm sure if you've had a bad neighbor, they probably thought you were the bad neighbor. But, you know, whatever it is, they get back there. There's animosity. There's some animosity, it seems. There's some issues, at least, between Abram and Lot. It doesn't ever come to the point where it seems like they dislike each other or hate each other. but they decide to go their separate ways. So once again, for the author of Genesis, this idea of separation of humans from each other is continued with the story of Abram and Lot, where Abram just says, look, Lot, like, you're my nephew, you know, your family, I love you, we're not getting along. So look over the whole land here. Whichever part of the land you want, I'll take the other. You know, he says, if you go right, I'll go left. You know, you go up, I'll go down, whatever it is. Like, you know, you choose and I'll take the other. So Lot looks out over the Jordan River Valley, sees it's fertile, sees that the land and the hills surrounding the Negev, or the desert, of course, and the hills surrounding that, where like Jerusalem will later be, are very barren. If you've been to Israel and you've seen the Judean wilderness, the same Judean wilderness that Jesus goes out to and is tempted in, it's a very barren landscape. And so Lot looks down at the Jordan River Valley, where to this day is very fertile down there, looks where they are and says, I'm going over there. And Abram says, fine, so be it. You go there. I'll stay here. Chapter 14, here's a picture here. About this time, war broke out in the region. King Amraphel of Babylonia, and it goes on, tells you about these kings who a war breaks out. They come down. The arrows on the far right that are heading down like south show the path of these kings. They come back up towards the Dead Sea there. You can kind of make out. Down to the very bottom of the picture is the Red Sea. So the next body of water up is the Dead Sea. And that's the region around where Lot is living at this time. So they basically kidnap him. They take him, and they take him all the way up to a place called Dan. You can see there, not where Damascus is at the top of that map, but the other little city up there that the red arrows and the green arrows are pointing to. That's where Lot is taken to, the city of Dan. And then the green arrows are, of course, when Abraham finds out that Lot has been taken, he goes to rescue him. The green arrows there are his path going up to find Lot and to bring him back. If you've been to Israel with me or otherwise, and you've been to Tel Dan, to that city of Dan, you can actually see the gate there that Abraham would have gone through to go into the city. Now, it has like I chose a picture that has like a door frame cut out of it so you can see like where it would have been, but it was a gate to the city, so it wouldn't have been just a single door. It's much bigger, and you kind of can't make out, maybe you can, kind of the archway that's above that door. That would have been the gate into the city. So to this day, you can go and see the gate that Abraham would have gone through when he then confronted the kings up there to get his nephew Lot back. So even within that short story, what is the author of Genesis doing but showing us separation and togetherness, separation, reunification. Just in a short little story about these random kings starting a war. They come down, they take Lot for who knows why, we're not told, but there's the separation there between Abram and Lot, and then Lot's taken, but then Abram still goes and gets him and brings him back because he's part of his family there. In chapter 15, we're going to get more of a look. This is the covenant and promises to Abraham are repeated multiple times, and you can kind of see that here on this chart. Chapter 12, that's written at the top, that kind of encompasses all three of these aspects. Chapter 15 here, chapter 17, and chapter 22 are going to repeat the promises of God to Abraham and this covenant with Abraham. And it kind of lays out there how some of what the promise is and how it's fulfilled. You know, in chapter 15 here, chapter 15, verse 1, after this, the story of Abram and Lot, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then God said to him, So shall your offspring or seed be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. So it seems like at this point, Abram's starting to get a little worried because he had been promised by God before that his descendants would, be a blessing in the entire world. And meanwhile, years later, no descendants. So it seems like Abram's getting a little worried, and that's why the words here at the beginning of chapter 15, don't be afraid, Adam, or don't worry, Adam. I'm your shield, your very great reward. And then tells him, Abram's like, well, still ain't got no child. And this guy Eliezer, one of my servants, he's going to get everything I have because I don't have any children. And God says he's not going to inherit. A son of your own flesh and blood will be your inheritance, will be your descendant, and will be the one that I bless the world through. So that here in chapter 15, this idea of a promise of a nation, it's going to be later fulfilled with the covenant that God makes with Moses, establishing the nation of Israel. The promise of a name is coming, but was also evident in chapter 12. That name is kind of fulfilled with covenant of David, David as king, that the descendant of Abraham and his named dynasty with David. And then, of course, the worldwide blessing that is evident in chapter 12, but also coming in chapter 22 that we'll see next week. And that's fulfilled, at least from the Christian perspective, by Jesus' later arrival. It's interesting that in chapter 15 here, that it's the first time that Abraham speaks to God. In all the other times before, God speaks to Abraham and Abraham obeys, but this is the first time that Abraham actually speaks back to God or says something back to God, which may be, again, God already knowing that Abraham's a little worried about, him not having any descendants yet. And Abraham finally speaks up about it. Let's skip down to verse 13. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. So whoever's writing this later, Moses or a later author, that's already happened. So if you're the reader and listener of this story in Genesis, you know that you and your ancestors have just spent 400 years in captivity in Egypt. So the idea that the author of Genesis is showing here that God is already telling Abraham, I know this is going to happen, means that God already knows that's coming and already has a solution for it, at the end. And if you're the reader and listener hearing this from Moses, writing this down, that would bring you comfort. Okay, God, we're in the midst of this. Either I'm following Moses right now or I'm following Joshua right now. We're about to go in and capture the promised land, whatever it is, and fight these people who don't want us there as invaders. If you're worried about that, but you know that God already told Abraham, I know this is coming. I know they're going to be in captivity. I know there's going to be separation between myself and my people, but there's a reunification coming. There's a togetherness still coming on the horizon there. We're going to look at the story of Hagar and Sarah and Abram. But are there any questions or comments? We went through a few of those chapters and things pretty quick right there. Are there any just comments or questions? All right, well, let's look at chapter 16 here. Yeah.
This will come into what you're saying. I had a question. If people practice monogamy, was that the standard practice? Why didn't you just have more wives? That's one question. But then God's promise is that his descendants will be of his flesh and of his bone, right? And it reminds me that of when a husband and wife comes together, bone and flesh, right? Mm-hmm. Because he did have, we'll get to that, but it was his descendant that he had without Sarai, right? So it just didn't apply, that promise, or it just didn't apply a being of your bone and flesh to him, but also to his monogamous wife.
Yeah, that's true. And you're right. We're getting to that with this story coming in. And we're actually going to see Abraham actually make the case to God of, why don't you just bless Ishmael instead of, at this point, Isaac was not born. So he does tell God, why don't you just bless Ishmael, who is already here and is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So
right,
chapter 16, yeah,
We got
on Zoom.
another question, from Pam Larson. Didn't God add a fourth promise in chapter 13, verses 14 through 17, that of giving Abram and his descendants the land forever?
Yeah, I think later that will come about when, in the time of Moses, that they'll certainly see that. And if Moses is writing this, then already there's that aspect of the land. Because if Moses is writing this while they're wandering in the desert, or is writing it while he's turning over the leadership to Joshua, because remember, Moses doesn't actually go into the promised land. Joshua is going to lead the Israelites into the promised land. So if Moses is writing at that time, or if a later author is writing, either way, there's already been or is about to be the idea of God giving them the land. So certainly for the author of Genesis, that idea or that so-called fourth promise would be a promise of that land, the promised land. Thanks, Pam. Chapter 16, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. So this is one picture here up on the screen of, in this painting, neither Sarah or Hagar look very happy about this. And certainly it's interesting, the author of Genesis never tells us Hagar's perspective. So Bob mentioned, the idea of monogamy or having multiple wives. It's hard to know for sure what Hagar would have thought about this, because you can see it from two different perspectives. First of all, she's just a tool being used. That can't feel good. Hagar, it says she's an Egyptian, and the NIV says slave. That's probably in our mind a little too harsh of a term. In other words, she was probably more of a employee that really had no other options. Now, whether you consider that a slave or not, we don't know. But she's certainly most likely given to Abram and Sarah when they leave Egypt, that she's part of this riches that Pharaoh gives to them. So he sends him out with, a bunch of wealth, including men servants and maid servants, and that would have undoubtedly, most likely included Hagar. That's where she comes from here. That's how she gets associated with Abraham's family. Now, again, you can see how that would be, if you were Hagar, that would not be something that you want to do. On the other hand, if you are Hagar and you have no other options of where to go, you have no male descendant, you seemingly have no male relative who can look after you and provide for you. So if she doesn't have somewhere to go, then her only option is to stay with Abraham and Sarah. And if she gives birth to a descendant, a son, or an offspring of Abraham, that would solidify her position as being provided for the rest of her life. So you can also think that, hey, Hagar, maybe she was not super excited about the idea, but she also saw the upside. But the author of Genesis doesn't tell us either way what Hagar thinks of this situation. From the author of Genesis' perspective, she seems to have no option. She doesn't have the right to refuse this, at least for the author of Genesis. Whether she would have wanted to refuse it or not, we don't know. But she seems to have no choice in the matter. So verse 4, he slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, that's Sarah. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. So Sarah blames Abraham, for the cause of the problems here. Why? We don't know. It doesn't say. But Abraham also doesn't deny the allegations. He doesn't say you're wrong about that. For Sarah, we don't know. When it says in verse 2, it says, "Go sleep with my slave, perhaps I can build a family through her." The Hebrew there says, like, to be built up. In most Christian commentaries, it'll talk about how Sarah had the intention of basically adopting an offspring of Hagar and Abram as her own. In other words, when it said, maybe I can build a family through her, it's kind of saying that whatever offspring she has would be like considered Sarah's children. That's a possibility, but we don't know that just from what the author of Genesis is telling us. There could have been still some, in that day and age, there was a very real understanding of fertility as kind of a volatile thing. So when she says, I could be built up if you do this, what she could mean is if I share my marital bed with this woman and for you, that as a result, if she has offspring, it could mean that my fertility will spring forth, that I'll be able to have children after that. So it's not that she certainly doesn't ever adopt Ishmael as her own child. So it's questionable whether she would have ever meant that from the beginning. Certainly, it seems like this was not supposed to be an ongoing thing happening. That Abram is supposed to conceive with Hagar, and then when it says she gave her to him as his wife, we don't know if that's supposed to actually mean like he was going to take a second wife and that was Hagar. Not from the way that she's treated after this, that doesn't seem like a likely case. Her giving Hagar to Abram as his wife could simply mean the marital duty of having an offspring with you. And that until that happened, that Abram and Hagar would continue to sleep together, but once the offspring is conceived, that should cease. There seems to be that understanding, because look what happens next that we just read. You're responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. So when we look at that, it looks like she's saying all of this to Abram. That she's saying, she's certainly saying to Abram, you're responsible for the wrong that's been done to me. But when she says, may the Lord judge between you and me, the you is feminine. So she might actually be turning, it seems, for the author of Genesis, and talking now to Hagar. So Sarah says to Abram, you're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. And then turns to Hagar and says, may the Lord judge between you and me. So it's almost like a picture of she's catching them in bed together still. That they're still sleeping. It tells us right here that she already knows she's pregnant, that Hagar knows she's pregnant. Because what else would, like, when Abram says, do with her whatever you think best, right after that says, Sarah mistreated or abused Hagar, and Hagar flees. So what could get Sarah so worked up, if not a feeling of this betrayal? If she's just simply jealous, would Abram allow her to mistreat and abuse her to the point that Hagar flees? Maybe, but probably not likely. But if there's a continuing relationship between Abram and Hagar that was not supposed to be happening after Hagar conceived, I think we can understand a little bit more of how Sarai would be so upset. That certainly doesn't give her a right, I don't think, to mistreat and abuse Hagar, but that's what happens. Continuing verse 6 into verse 7, Sarai mistreated Hagar, so Hagar fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. So she's traveling, the picture is she's traveling back towards Egypt at this point, the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I am running away from my mistress Sarai, she said. The angel said, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. And the angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. So a couple things to note here. Here's another picture that is a little more like Sarah's pushing Hagar. That might tell us a little, it's kind of symbolic of the idea that Hagar had no choice here between Abram's actions embracing Hagar and Sarah pushing her towards them. Kind of tells us, again, from the artist's perspective here, that she had no options. So Sarai mistreats or abuses Hagar, and Hagar flees into the desert, which is an incredibly desperate thing to do. Because again, she has nobody to care for her. And she's pregnant. And yet she still seems to be willing to risk the journey back all the way to Egypt because of how bad she's been treated by Sarah. A couple of the parallels here between Hagar and the Israelite story, 400 years later, the time that the reader and listener is hearing this story for the first time. Hagar's an Egyptian, probably a gift from Pharaoh, and mistreated by her Israelite masters. And later on, the Israelites will, of course, be mistreated by their Egyptian masters. Hagar flees to the desert, to the wilderness of Shur. The Israelites are going to flee also to the desert, to the same wilderness of Shur. Moses cries out to God for water in the desert. Hagar finds water, but does not call out to God. Then Sarai mistreats Hagar, so she fled from him. The angel Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. So kind of a summary there. Sarah abuses, Hagar flees, but God finds. That's what the author of Genesis wants us to understand about this point in the story. Sarai and Abraham's no help. He just says, do with her whatever you want. And Sarah mistreats her. And Hagar flees, but God finds her. Yeah, Ra?
Got a question
Sure.
from Corey and Grace. It says, isn't Sarah the one that was disobedient and did not believe that God would give her a child?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're probably going to cover a little more next week. But I will say quickly that when you talk about her being disobedient, I think that's an understanding that we've come to believe to try and reconcile how Sarah could be abusive and mistreating Hagar, because the promise is only given at that point to Abraham. It's Abraham who is told, you are going to have a child. Sarah is never given that promise. Now, she will be in a couple chapters here that we'll start with next week, but she is not given that promise at this point. Only Abraham is. So when we say disobedient, there was no expectation of her at this point that she was going to be the one promised an offspring by God. That was the assumption until 10 more years had gone by again since they left Egypt, and she still had not given birth, that she still had no offspring to give to Abraham or with Abraham. So to say she's disobedient, I think, is us reading that back into the story all these years later, that because we're trying to reconcile in our own minds how Sarah could be. She's certainly no hero in this story at this point. But for the author of Genesis, she's not a villain either. And neither is Abraham. Abraham's very passive in this. Do with her. He doesn't argue when she says it's all your fault. He says, do with her whatever you want. He's very passive. He's certainly no hero at this point in the story either, but he's also not a villain. And for the author of Genesis, we're going to see that over and over and over again in Genesis, and Abraham and his family and his descendants. That for the author of Genesis, there's no theology and doctrine to get from Genesis. There's no big moral, epiphanies for us to find from Genesis. And when we look at these men and women, it's like, oh, this is a terrible person. And then the next thing you're like, oh, this person's awesome. This person is so obedient to God. Oh, this guy's an idiot. Or like this woman, she's like standing up, trying to fulfill the promises of God. Oh, she's abusing this woman who's under her care. There's really no heroes and villains for the author of Genesis. There's nobodies who God makes into somebodies for the author of Genesis. And so, the angel says to Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? For the first time in our story, somebody calls Hagar by her name. She's never been called by her name at this point. She's been referred to, or she's been talked at, or talked about, but nobody ever calls her by her name until God comes and finds her. God acknowledges what Sarah and Abraham have not, that she's a person. She's somebody who is not just to be considered an employee or a slave or a servant, a tool to be used to produce offspring, that she's a person and she has a name. And God acknowledges that. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. And again, for the first time in our story, Hagar speaks. Until this point, again, she's only been spoken to and spoken about. But when God comes and finds her and calls her by her name, she is given a voice now. She speaks back. The angel said, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard of your misery. So while all the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even Joseph, are going to hear those words about increasing numbers, your descendants, Hagar's the only woman to ever hear that promise. You expect it to be given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, but Hagar is also given that same promise about the descendants. Hagar, it says, verse 13, Hagar gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. What's interesting is that in the entire Bible, only Hagar is allowed to name God. Now we have lots of names for God. Jehovah Jireh, some of the Elohim, Nisi, Shalom, Sabaoth, Rohi, Rapha, El Shaddai, El Elyon, Adonai, Father, Comforter, Fortress, Deliverer, Righteousness. We got lots of names for God in the Bible. But only one person is allowed to give God a name. And that was extremely important in their understanding. Remember when the story we started out with the first week about Jacob wrestling with God? And what does Jacob do at the end? He wants to know the person's name that he's been wrestling with. The person says, why do you want to know my name? Knowing that what Jacob's after is power over him. Because if you name someone in this day and age, it was like you could call on them later and have them at your disposal. So nobody's allowed to give God a name except Hagar. Hagar says, you are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. Let's see that clock. We'll close this week with this idea. We would expect the most righteous of all men in the Bible to be able to give God a name. We expect a man of unbelievable faith. We would expect a man of extreme conviction that God is the only God. We would expect a man who knows God intimately. Frankly, we would expect a man to be the one who gets to name God. But it's Hagar, somebody who probably doesn't have a very good concept about who God is. Now, she's been with Abraham and Sarah for at least 10 years, so she probably at this point has adopted worship of Yahweh because now she is gone from Egypt and she's with Abraham and Sarah. So she's probably adopted worship of Yahweh, but doesn't know God intimately, doesn't know, who God is, just knows this is the God of the people who I belong with now. And she has left, her Egyptian gods and goddesses behind. The Egyptian gods and goddesses, I'm sure, had no idea who she was. At least in her mind, they would not have known who she was, they would not have heard her voice, and they certainly would not have seen her. She was an invisible woman. And yet all of a sudden, here comes Yahweh, the God of Abraham, who sees her, who finds her, who calls her by name, who lets her speak, and then when she says, you are the God who sees me, I have now seen the one who sees me. So God is both seer and seen in this story with Hagar. The woman who's discarded by her own people, Pharaoh just gives her away to Abraham and Sarah to take with them away from her homeland, just discarded by her own people. That this invisible woman is seen by the invisible God. And as God is made visible to her, so too is she made visible to the world. When God says to her, your descendants will be so great. The same promise that's given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and Hagar, that promise of those descendants is what makes her visible to the world. So an invisible woman is seen by the invisible God, and just as she is made visible, God is made visible to her, she is made visible to the world by God. And so again, she's kind of she's kind of one of the ultimate examples for the author of Genesis in his book of a nobody becoming a somebody. It's almost, I mean, in the book of Genesis, there's almost nobody who's more of a nobody than Hagar is. And yet she becomes such a somebody by God, made a somebody by God, that she is given the same promise of a great descendant, the same promise that's only given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we're going to pick up next week there, continue the story of Abraham and Sarah, and we'll talk about, their involvement with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what happened there. And then we'll really focus next week on the story of the binding of Isaac, or the sacrifice of Isaac. So we'll get into Isaac's story. We'll talk about, did Isaac actually die in that, or did he live? We'll talk about, did Abraham and Sarah get divorced, as some people think, or did they stay married? And then we'll talk about Esau and Jacob as well, and the story of Jacob stealing Esau's blessing and birthright. And was he right to do that, or was he wrong to do that? So we'll pick up there next week. So hope to see you then. Thanks for being